Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have some tidbits. I have photos to share of gift recipients modeling the gift knits that I recently finished. I want to talk a little bit about an upcoming event that occurs every year on my channel in February. And I want to update you on my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and the 1990s. So let's get started. A couple of weeks ago, I was mentioning that from the very first knitting pattern that I ever worked from, I recognized how similar knitting pattern instructions were to computer code. I had been a computer science major for a while in college, and I just recognized the logic behind the instructions and how similar they were to computer code. Now, I got a comment on that video from Steph, who mentioned that there was a video, which it's actually a TEDx talk from Melbourne, Australia, about a woman who it's a 6-minute talk called Grandma Was a Hacker. And she talked about the different ways in which she has used knitting to display binary code in different ways, and treating knits and purls as a 1 or a 0, and different ways that she has used knitting to that effect and put secret codes into her knitted work. So that's a really interesting video. Like I said, it's about 6 minutes long. I'll leave a link down in the show notes if that's something that you're interested in. This tidbit came up in my Twitter feed. I follow a lot of dress historians and fashion historians, and this one is from Ella McHawk. And they were these rose-flavored biscuits, she calls them, which of course in the US we'd call cookies. And they were Jane Austen inspired. It turns out she's an academic who is studying the fabrics and textiles that are part of the Jane Austen family collection at a museum. And one of the things that she does as a hobby is to create these iced biscuits that include like designs from textiles that are inspired by different textiles. They are truly works of art. I'm going to show you the Jane Austen ones right here. They're just gorgeous. So what I'm going to do is link to her website and also a podcast where she was interviewed about her biscuit art. So you can learn more about what she does, and you can see more of her work as well. It's just amazingly beautiful. I'd really encourage you to take a look. This tidbit came to me from Clickety Clack on Ravelry, who sent me a message about a book that they were reading that they were really enjoying. The name of the book, as they gave it to me, was A Short History of the World According to Sheep by Sarah Coulthard. That is the UK title. So there is a version of the same book that came out in the US earlier this spring that is called Follow the Flock: How Sheep Shaped Human Civilization. So I have not read this book yet. It just comes recommended from Clickety Clack. I did look to see if our local textile center had it so that I could check it out and take a look at it before I told you about it, but they did not have it. But I can give you the description of this book. It says, an addictively free-ranging survey of the massive impact that the humble and lovable sheep have had on human history. From the plains of ancient Mesopotamia to the rolling hills of medieval England to the vast sheep farms of modern-day Australia, the domesticated ungulates of the genus Ovis sheep have been central to the human story. So Sally Coulthard weaves the rich and fascinating story of sheep into a vivid and colorful tapestry, thickly threaded with engaging anecdotes and remarkable ovine facts, whose multiple strands reflect the deep penetration of these woolly animals into every aspect of human society and culture. So it's definitely a book that I want to read. I will leave links down below. I'll leave both titles because if you're in different countries, that book may be available under different titles, just depending on where you are. I think this one came to me from my Instagram feed. I follow Allison Kurlaski, who works for Golden Peak Media. They own Interweave Publications, Interweave Knits, and those various magazines. And she has a podcast called Fiber Nation. I've talked about this podcast in the past, but this particular episode that came out just last week is part one about, I think there's going to be two parts, but it's part one about the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. So if you live in the US, you probably have, and you're interested in the fiber arts, you've probably heard of this particular factory fire. So I listened to the first part of the podcast and I went to look to see if the second part had been released. I think it comes out every 2 weeks, so it might not be out until next week or maybe even not until the new year. I'm not sure, but it's really interesting and it really lays the foundation for what was going on in the textile world in New York City during that time and what the conditions were like and what the workers were fighting for. So the description for the podcast is that on a warm day in 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York. Within minutes, it engulfed the top 3 stories of the factory building. 146 people died in the blaze. 123 of them were young women who worked there. It was one of the worst industrial disasters in the United States. So it's a really fascinating part of textile history, of US history, of working women in the United States, all of that combined together. And I'm finding it really interesting. I can't wait until part 2 comes out. This next tidbit came to me, I believe, in an email from Yin Yang Knitter, who frequently sends me interesting tidbits. And it was a link to a business that sells breed-specific yarns. So the year that I started Casual Friday, which was January of 2018, I had a goal in mind for that year, which was I wanted to really explore other yarns that were made from breeds of wool that I hadn't encountered before, and that I was going to make a real effort to seek out yarns made from different wool breeds and compare them to things that I had used in the past. And what I quickly discovered was that it wasn't that easy in the shops at the time to actually find wools that specifically mentioned what breed they were from. And it was during that year that I learned to spin, because that seemed to be the most accessible way to get at these more unusual breeds, or to know where what the wool came from. And since then, it's more and more, you can find some of these smaller mills or smaller producers, and you can find yarns even that are already spun up for you in case you're not a spinner yourself. So it's always interesting to me to be able to find these. There are a lot of them in the UK. They have a lot of these more rare breeds available there in already spun format. But we are getting more and more of them in the US. And this particular one is called solitudewool.com. They are based in the sort of the DC area of the East Coast. They're 5 partners. They're shepherds and fiber artists who love wool, and together with the help from small local flocks of different breeds of sheep and small American mills for processing, we create small batch yarns and fibers. There are hundreds of breeds of sheep, and they grow amazingly different types of wool. We are lucky in the mid-Atlantic to have many farms raising and preserving diverse breeds, some endangered, some heritage breeds, and many, many breeds that you won't find in commercial yarns. So if this is something that you are interested in, particularly if you live here in the US and you're interested in buying yarn that was completely produced here in the US by American shepherds and small mills and want to support that, I will leave a link to their website down below. They have a couple of links on their site. There was they were featured on a local TV station at one point when they were at like a farmer's market or someplace that came to visit them. They had a reporter talking to them about their different wool or their different sheep and where they get the wool for their yarns. So if that's of interest to you, I, as always, will leave a link down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me actually from my husband in a text message. He said, I'm sure you've seen this already, and I hadn't. Now, this is a New York Times article, so if you don't have a subscription, or I think sometimes you can read the articles, a limited number of them per month maybe. It's called Where Did Your Sweater Come From? And it's an article about a brand that produces cashmere sweaters. And these are very expensive cashmere sweaters, but they on their tag are able to cite what region the cashmere came from, like the bale that your cashmere wool was included in that was then used to create the yarn that was then used to knit the sweater that you are purchasing, so that you can kind of track that lineage. And one of the things they do is make sure that their fair labor practices and their humane farming techniques and all of that. So again, these are very expensive sweaters. So I thought it was an interesting article. I think one of the things that I'm finding is much more possible if you are a knitter yourself, rather than just trying to purchase something and understand where it came from, is that as knitters, we do have more and more access to yarns where we know where it came from in general. Either we know the specific farm it came from, or we know the mill who is getting their wool from local providers. And sometimes you'll have a farm that mills their own yarn, or they have just their wool specifically milled, and you might even know the name of the alpaca or the name of the sheep where your yarn came from. So there are other ways of finding this sort of thing out. I did discover a year or two ago that there was a sock brand, I think it's Lang Wools, like Yeah Wool, I think that's the one, that has a QR code on it, and you can find out where your wool came from. And that one is a little bit broader in terms of it's a fairly big region, but you know, it would tell you this particular region of South America is where your wool came from. So there are some of the bigger yarn companies that are doing some of this to some extent. So I would be interested in knowing what other brands might be doing something similar to this in terms of, that would be interesting to a knitter, like knowing where their yarn came from or knowing where their tools came from or that sort of thing. If any of you know about interesting things like that where you can track where your yarn came from, I'd be interested in that. You can leave it down in the comments. This tidbit came in my Twitter feed. I think somebody must have retweeted it because it's from an account that I don't follow. It was this picture right here, which you see, with the caption that mauve dye was first synthesized accidentally by William Henry Perkin in 1856. His process made purple a much easier and cheaper color to wear and led to many more discoveries in medicine and other fields, as well as pigments. I knew that synthetic dyes were a product of the 19th century. There was a lot going on in the textile industry and in all kinds of industries in the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. And I knew that synthetic dyes was one of the things that started happening in the mid-19th century. By the end of the 19th century, we get our first synthetic fiber, which is rayon. It's really considered a semi-synthetic fiber because it's derived from natural products, but it's broken down in this whole chemical process, and it creates this fiber that we call rayon. So these processes were all going on in the 19th century. So I looked up this guy. I'm going to leave you a link to the Wikipedia article on him. He was 18 years old, so I think he was at university, and his professor was given a challenge to synthesize quinine, and in one attempt, Perkin oxidized aniline using potassium dichromate, whose toluidine, I'm not good at chemical names. Impurities reacted with the aniline and yielded a black solid, suggesting a failed organic synthesis. Cleaning the flask with alcohol, Perkin noticed purple portions of the solution. So this just created this craze in purple dye at that point, because it was amazing that people could do that. But I'm going to leave a link down to the article about this kid basically who figured out how to synthesize purple back in, what was it, 1856. So that's pretty cool if that's something that you're interested in knowing more about how synthetic dyes came about. This was really one of the first. This tidbit came to me in my Instagram feed. Last spring, I found out through the Wool channel, which is Clara Park's website that has to do with wool, and there's community and letting each other know about things. And there was a podcast called Yarns at YinHoo that was doing a 7 or 8-part interview with a woman who had done a PhD basically on Elizabeth Zimmerman. One of the things that they talked about were the influences in Elizabeth's life that caused her to start this business of Schoolhouse Press and writing books and having this newsletter and importing yarns that she was selling. And that was that in the 1950s, post-war, there were a lot of yarns that were synthetic. And Elizabeth was looking for wool yarn. She was having a very difficult time finding 100% wool yarns. And she was also having a real hard time finding any information that allowed her to create her own designs, like technique information. So when I was listening to this podcast, they talked about a book that had been very influential to Elizabeth that was called Number Knitting, and it had been published in the 1950s. Well, I've been working on a long-term project to knit my way through the 20th century, a sweater from each decade. And one of the things that I have been doing in my research is trying to find what sorts of books were available to knitters at different times that would teach them actual techniques about knitting, not just here's a pattern for you to follow. And so when I heard about this number knitting book, I went out online and I found a copy. It's the most money I've ever spent on a vintage knitting book, but it's not as bad as what you see now. If you were trying to buy this book now online, it would be $330, even up to $700. I did not pay that much. What's fascinating about this is that everything's based on garter stitch. So the woman who wrote this book, Virginia, is it Bellamy Woods or Woods Bellamy? Virginia Woods Bellamy, was that she was describing this, relationship that garter stitch has, where it's one stitch for every one ridge. So there's this, if you have 5 stitches per inch, you'll have 5 ridges per inch, and every ridge is 2 rows of knitting, and which allows you to create these modular knits and create 45-degree angles and 90-degree angles. A lot of modern blankets and modular knits are based on these concepts. And it is something that I haven't seen in previous patterns, or that there was any sign that people were really aware of this that I can find. But I was interested in this book, very interested in seeing what had influenced Elizabeth Zimmerman. And then one of my viewers told me that Kelly Vaughn, who goes by knitswag, had a copy of that book that she digitized, so you could get a digitized copy of this book for far less than what you could get it in hard copy form. But that she was also enhancing the charts, and she was doing some work to make this to bring this book kind of back to life. She's doing test knits and stuff on this. So I was so fascinated to hear about this. What came across my Instagram feed this week was that Kelly is a guest on Yarns at YinHoo, and she's talking about this project that she's been working on to kind of bring number knitting back to life, and doing the charts and working with these garments, patterns that are in there, modernizing them a little bit. And so it's a really fascinating thing to see, you know, something that started 70 years ago that then Elizabeth Zimmerman was, you know, keeping alive for 20 or 30 years. And then Kelly is saying, you know, this is really worth exploring. This is so cool. I'm going to leave a link down below to Yarns at YinHoo and the interview with Kelly in particular, but you'd also be able to listen to that series on Elizabeth Zimmerman if it's something that you missed last summer, because it really is really interesting. And Elizabeth Zimmerman continues to have an influence on contemporary knitters today. So this is really part of our combined knitting history. This next tidbit came to me sort of indirectly, and it came out of a conversation that I participated in on Twitter a few days ago, where somebody said something about a crochet needle, and someone said, well, they're actually hooks. And I said, well, you know, some people do call them needles, and there's a long history of calling them needles. And I supplied this book, as which I will put up here and I will link down below, as an example. It was a book published in 1856, I believe. They were talking about the origins of crochet in that book, and they mentioned that it had only come to this country, you know, a couple of decades before, and they talked about the crochet needle in that book. So and that wasn't the only place I found it. It was just the first one that I could find when I searched all my digitized manuals as an example of a crochet needle. But what it did get me to doing was to read a little bit more about the history of crochet. I've done this in the past. I'm not a big crocheter, so I don't know that much. All I know is that crochet, as we know it today, is really a product of the early 19th century. It's the newest of all of these needle arts. And that what came before that was something called shepherd's knitting, which used a hook, and the handle was much bigger. So you have something that was fairly big in the handle, and it had a little hook, and it was really used for what we would call today slip stitch crochet. Like that was the first way that people did what later would be called crochet, and then with other types of stitches created soon after that. So like the first crochet patterns were in the 1820s. And then this woman who I've heard of many times because her name is plastered all over so many needlework books of the 19th century, to the point where I thought it was a made-up name. First of all, the name sounds so ridiculous that you like somebody just made that up. And secondly, maybe there's multiple people going under that name, like it was a nom de plume or something. It turns out she was a real person. Her name is Mademoiselle de Riego. She's got this very long name. She published her first book on crochet when she was 18. She essentially invented Irish crochet, which brought a lot of Irish people out of poverty because they could make this lace that wasn't real lace because it was done with these crochet techniques. But she produced like not some in the 80s or 90s books during her lifetime, and she was not an elderly woman when she died. I think she was younger than I am. She's pretty amazing. So if you are interested, even if you don't crochet, like I don't really crochet that much, if you're interested in the history of crochet, in particular about Mademoiselle de Riego, fascinating. Somebody did some history on her and was looking her up in census records and trying to find out more about her. But I'm going to leave various links down in the show notes that you might find interesting to learn about crochet and the history of crochet, and in particular this woman who is really influential in the 19th century, not just for crochet, but all kinds of needlework. She was just amazing. You just wonder how she got it all done. In the past couple of Casual Friday videos, I have been showing you about a couple of projects that I was making for my daughter and her boyfriend Sam, who have been here in the US since, he's been here since early November. She's been here since sometime in October. They're heading back tomorrow, Christmas Day, to fly back to the Netherlands. But while they were here, I took them to a yarn shop. They picked out yarn, they picked out the projects they wanted me to make, and I finished them and I showed them to you. But often, as is the case, when I finish an item that's for a gift, I can show you the item, but then that's the end of it. Well, they sent me some fantastic photographs of them modeling the things I made them. They were in Santa Fe's at 7,200 feet, which is about 2,000 meters. And then they went on a hike that was up even higher, and just incredible vistas. I thought you guys might enjoy seeing some of the things I knit on an actual human being, worn by the person that they were intended for. So any of you who have been watching me for more than a year have probably heard me talking about Finish It February. It's something I've been doing on my channel since I started Casual Friday at the beginning of 2018. And it was an idea that I first heard about in 2016. In 2016, I started the year by going through all of my yarn, getting rid of half of it so I had room to store the yarn that I did have left, reorganize my books and my patterns. And the last thing I did was pull every single unfinished project I had out of every bag, box, bin, whatever. I knew there were a fair number of them, but I really had no idea how many there were, and discovered there were more than 40 of them. Once I got past the shock of that, I went through the process of evaluating what I was just going to throw out, because I was like, I don't care about this. I don't like it. I don't want it when it's done. I'm not going to finish it. One of them I gave away. It was all knitted, but it needed to be assembled. So I gave it to a friend who had made this particular project many times, and she was happy to take it. And then the rest of them I worked on that year. I allowed myself to start a new project if it was small and a gift and I had a deadline. But otherwise, I just worked through as many of those projects as I could. And I got at least 30 of them done. I think there were a handful left by the end of the year. But during this process, as I was doing this, I was also a member of a group of knitters who were either from the Twin Cities or from Minnesota in general. I don't remember which one. And they had a year-long theme that the group did, and that year it was whips off the needle. And the idea was trying to get all your UFOs done, and then you could post pictures of them. And the timing was just fantastic. And so I was just plowing through them, and I kept posting new, oh, now I finished this. And someone said, oh, what I do every year is finish it February. I just devote February to finishing projects, and that way I can kind of keep on top of them. And I thought, well, that is a brilliant idea. But I continued through 2016, and once I was in the fall, I'd finished everything I could stand to finish, and moved on to new projects in 2017. There was no need for me to do a Finish It February in 2017 because I really had nothing that was unfinished at that point. But in 2018, I had accumulated a year's worth of UFOs. And that coincidentally was right around the time I started Casual Friday. So every year in February, I talk about this, and every year I kind of give tips on things that I've learned from other people that work well for other people, or just give ideas about this. But this is something that I'm always looking at the end of the year. I'm thinking about, what did I do? What do I want to do? What do I not want to do next year? And I'm kind of taking a look at what I haven't finished. And the one thing I know is that Finish It February is always going to come up. So the big UFO on my pile right now is my 1960s vintage sweater, where I knit all the pieces, I was putting it together, and the sleeves did not fit right. And I realized I needed to rip them out and reknit them. And so I ripped one of them out, and I never did reknit them. I was just so sick of that project. So I haven't touched it, but I've known that Finish It February was coming. So just to give you an idea of what it is, you just bring, and you can do this in a lot of different ways. For some people, they have things they have to do in February. It's not a good time, or they don't know about it soon enough, which is why I'm telling you about it now. Some people decide devoting a whole month to it is too much. but just having a regular habit of dressing UFOs works. And so some people do finish it Friday. So that's what they knit on Friday, is something from their UFO pile. And there are a lot of different ways you can do this. You can pick some things that you want to finish, or you can just rotate through things. There are a lot of different ways that you can address this, and a lot of ways of approaching how you even evaluate all of your unfinished things, and so that it's not quite as overwhelming. Because I know for me, when I had 44 of them or however many it was like made me sick. And I had to try to figure out, how can I deal with this without feeling guilt or overwhelmed or whatever. Just know that Finish It February is coming up. We'll be starting it on February 1st. And in the next few weeks, I will be giving you tips about how to go through your UFOs and decide if that's something that you want to participate in, and how you might want to do it in a way that works for you. 3 years ago today, I was sitting at my desk thinking about what I might want to do for Casual Friday in the coming year, like what kinds of things might be interesting to look into, to research, to talk about, to explore. And one of the things that just came to my mind was, I wonder what sorts of knitting patterns might have been published in the newspaper 100 to 150 years ago. So I knew that there had been knitting patterns published in the second half of the 20th century, because there was even a syndicated column by a woman named Pat Trexler, I think her name was. And actually, I have a book that she wrote, and it says famous writer of Pat's Pointers. So I knew that she had a syndicated column that was in the papers until I think the early 90s. And she included things like knitting patterns, or she'd answer questions. And so I knew that existed, but I wondered what had come before that, like what would have been in the paper. And part of the reason I wondered about this was because I do genealogy and a lot of family history research, and I was kind of familiar with what newspapers were like around 1900, like what they were like before 1900 and after 1900, and how most of them were published at the county level. And they would include news about the townships within the county. They would include just general county news, state news, national, international, and a lot of the news came off the wires. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that they had local people doing any kind of news reporting. And the newspapers might only be 8 pages long, and they'd come out once a week. So there wouldn't have been a whole lot of room in those papers. So I was just curious about this. So I started looking, and right away I found out, yes, there were knitting patterns published in the newspaper. A lot of them were in the Boston Globe, which is a daily newspaper. And it turned out they were the first newspaper in the country to have a section devoted to women's interests, which was cooking and cleaning, basically. And they didn't really have writers devoted to the content. It was mostly user-generated. And so they didn't have to spend any money paying a salary for the content. They had people writing in asking for patterns or recipes or whatever, and other people sending them in. So a lot of the knitting patterns I was finding were in the Boston Globe. And there were a lot of sweater patterns, which that's of interest to me. I've always been a sweater knitter since I learned to knit in the 80s. But there weren't any pictures that were accompanying these patterns. They were just the text of the pattern. And I thought, well, that's weird. Who would do that? Who would knit a sweater that they didn't know what it was going to look like? But I kept looking, and very quickly I saw this picture. It's a drawing, and it accompanied a pattern for a lady's sweater. And that completely interested me, because I'm a lady and I like to knit sweaters for me. And I thought, well, that is a very interesting silhouette. I wonder how they do that. I had never been interested in vintage or antique knitting before. I was interested in the history of knitting and looking at things that were knitted, but not in knitting those things myself ever. I started reading the pattern and I noticed right away that all of these preconceived ideas I had about knitting, knitting patterns, knitters, all kinds of things, I could see were not true. It was clear to me based on the stitch counts that were required for this sweater that this was not knit at a super fine gauge, which is what I thought everything was. The pattern was missing some key information like what kind of yarn to use and how much of it was needed, but it did the knitting instructions, the instructions for knitting the stitches, very clear. And so clear that I could just draw a schematic, and I got to the very last instruction, which was, it said to line the front with ribbon and then sew the button and buttonhole. And I like where and how, I couldn't understand it because this is a very voluminous front of the sweater, lots of fabric, but it had a very fitted neck, ribbed neck, and a very fitted ribbed waist. Now, there were a bunch of decreases that were made in all of this fabric in order to make that ribbing around the waist very tiny, but it wouldn't be overlapping very much, if at all, at either one of these places, and yet there was all this fabric, and I couldn't figure out how that was supposed to work. So I wanted the answer because I really love understanding different construction methods for sweaters and also knitting techniques. I'm a master hand knitter. That's like, I totally geek out on that stuff, the analytical, technical, how does this work type of thing. And so I spent 4 days reading sweater patterns from that era and then the decades before and after, and I realized how much opportunity there was to learn and how much I didn't know about, and how much of what I thought I knew was just flat out wrong. And so I decided to knit this sweater, but I wasn't going to finish it. I just wanted to answer the question of how does this all come together? And so I started knitting it 4 days after I first saw the picture, and never intending to finish the sweater. And the further I got into it and the more patterns I was reading, the more I was finding in these digitized knitting manuals that I could find online, the more I realized what an incredible opportunity it was to learn things that were done so differently than how it's done today. Eventually, I did figure out how the front of that sweater closed, and I did finish it. And some of you have seen this many times. The first surprise about the sweater was the behavior of the fabric. Like, who knew that would ever happen? And it's the behavior of this fabric, which I wouldn't have understood or known about until I knit this sweater. But it was the behavior of this fabric that informed me of how the front of the sweater closed, because just of the way that it was like an accordion, that's how the back sides of the two parts of the front were actually facing each other. And then that would be where the ribbon would go, and the buttons and buttonholes would be on that ribbon, and then they would join the pieces in the front. This was an incredible learning opportunity. And so from then on, I thought it would be really interesting to study the evolution of the sweater. And the project has, I'm making up the rules for this and how I'm choosing the patterns and what I'm deciding to knit and why I'm deciding to knit it. My rules are really guidelines. There's just an effort to help me focus on what I'm going to choose. And I have changed sort of the scope of it or my focus of it throughout there. The more I've learned and the more I realized what time frames would be really important. So this was the first one, and it was published in the newspaper in 1906, but it was really originally published in the Columbia Book of Yarns in 1904. I'll leave a link down in the show notes so that if you want to look at the instructions for this pattern, you can do that. So my goal was to at first knit a sweater from each decade of the 20th century. I didn't really know if I'd do the last couple of decades because I learned to knit then, and what was that going to teach me. And after I'd knit 3 or 4 sweaters, I realized I really wanted to go back to the 1890s. And I've really settled on the 1890s to the 1990s. And lately, as I've thought about this more, I've realized that the 1990s really is the end of knitting patterns being shared solely through printed matter. So the 1990s or the 1890s was when I could really find any number of sweater patterns that were published. I did find one for a child in the 1880s in one book. That doesn't mean that the other ones didn't exist. It just means that there weren't very many of them. There weren't enough of them for me to find them. And in the 1890s, the sweaters were all shaped very similarly to each other, but there was a huge range of construction methods, which I found fascinating. Like, we want one sweater shape, want it to do one thing, but we're going to try it all different ways and see kind of what works the best, which I find fascinating. So once you get into the end of the 1990s, you're getting people on the internet, and people are sharing more and more on the internet. Independent designers have software that allows them to create their own patterns and publish them and give them and sell them in yarn shops. But then eventually you get other methods of digital distribution, like online knitting magazines, and then you get Ravelry, and which really allowed independent designers to publish to a worldwide audience and have people be able to find their patterns very easily. So things really changed after 2000. And so what I'm focused on is really the presentation of written sweater patterns between the 1890s and the 1990s, and looking at how the fashions changed, how the construction methods changed, because they were so varied early on, and then once you get into the mid-century, they kind of get locked into a very specific way most of the time. I've also really read a lot of stocking and sock patterns during this time period, because that's my other passion, is sock knitting. And so it could be, once I'm done with this project, that I'm gonna do a little bit more with socks and stockings. There's some interesting things going on there. So far I've done a sweater from the 1890s. This one that was from early 1900s. I've done one from World War II era, or World War I era. I've done a 1930s. I've done a 1950s. I've knitted all the pieces of my 1960s sweater, and then I need to reknit the sleeves because I didn't like the way they turned out. And I'm about to start my 1940s sweater. So I announced the 1940s sweater, I think it was in October, as a collaboration with Billy from Show and Tell Knitting. And so we were going to get started on that maybe in November. And then my daughter and her boyfriend came. We had a 10-day road trip to Santa Fe to see extended family for Thanksgiving. It was like everything. As soon as we decided to do the collaboration, my whole world plans all completely changed. So the 1940s sweater was kind of put to the side, and I did a lot of gift knitting and things for the holidays and for my kids, and which I'm happy to do. But now I'm getting ready to start this 1940s sweater. Now Billy has gone ahead and started her sweater, because who knew how long it was going to take me. So if you're interested in the progress that she has been making, I will leave links to her channel as well as to her Instagram, because she does post updates on her Instagram. You can kind of see what she's doing with that. So you'll see me talking more about the 1940s sweater. I did start swatching. I swatched to make sure my colors were going to work together, and swatching for gauge. You know, the gauge doesn't have to be exact, because I'm going to need to adjust it to fit my size anyway. This pattern comes in one size, so that's not a big concern. I have a few design things that I've been considering, that I've been trying to figure out. So I'm getting going on that right now. And but I wanted to update you, and especially if you are new and you haven't known about this long-term project, you might be interested in that. I will leave also a link to my Ravelry notebook that has all of the vintage things that I have knit in the past 3 years, all of those vintage projects. And you can take a look at those. And then you can also look through the Casual Friday podcasts for the past 3 years. As I've knit through these things, I've talked about the challenges and the progress and the finished items and all of that, in case that is something that you're interested in. But that is been on hiatus for a couple of months. I've done no sweater knitting in the past couple of months, and it's actually kind of nice to have a break from it and to knit a bunch of other things just for fun and for people who were gift recipients. I really love knitting for people who appreciate what it is I'm knitting, so that's been a real joy as well. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.